Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Colby Ranavati, Treasurer for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. We have ahead of the election cycle in November, we have a very exciting conversation this evening. The rural voter and the politics of place and the disuniting of America, which is the title of Professor Nicholas F. Jacobs and Daniel M. Shea's new book with Columbia University Press. We have provided the link and a discount code for this book in our reminder, but we will send it again with the link to the recording of this event. This event is being recorded, and we'll share it within 24 hours from today. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Nicholas F. Jacobs is an assistant professor of government at Colby College. He's a co-author of What Happened to the Vital Center, Presidentialism, Populist Revolt, and the Fracturing of America, published in 2022. And Daniel M. Shea, professor and chair of government at Colby College. Among his books includes Why Vote? Essential Questions About the Future of Elections in America, published in 2019. Without further ado, Nick and Dan, send it to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you all tonight. Let me go ahead and get Dan's and my presentation uploaded. If I could share my screen, please. There we go. Perfect. You know, Dan and I live less than an hour away from the tragic events that took place in Lewiston, Maine last week. You know, we don't like thinking about how our work is becoming more important in the midst of such tragedy. But while we'll make the case tonight that it was always important to understand rural voters and how rural voting fits into our political divide, we've learned over the last couple of days that it is becoming all the more important. Dan and I are here tonight to talk about our newest book, which came out just on Monday, The Rural Voter. And in this book, we try to make sense of this map, which has become all too familiar in explanations of American politics. A map that every 4 years we become well acquainted to. Deep pockets of blue on the coasts of the United States, and vast territories of red with little dots in between, of course, representing our big urban areas. We are divided by partisanship, but we are most seriously divided by place. And this is not just at the presidential level. Anybody that studies state level politics and what goes on in our states knows that the more rural the state is, the more likely that state is to be controlled by a Republican legislature and increasingly a Republican trifecta, with the upper and lower house of the state assembly and the governor controlled all by one party. And what's more remarkable is that if you've lived it, and if you study the history of just even recent presidential elections, you know that this is not the way it's always been. That compared to just 1976, Jimmy Carter beat out Gerald Ford, you can see that rural America was not always the bastion of republicanism, the bastion of conservative ideological thought that it once was. The realignment is not just contained to the South, but out through rural New England, where Dan and I are from, out through the Midwest, even rural parts of the Central West. No doubt you've heard some common explanations. This divide between rural and urban areas is the result of one or many of the following reasons. Well, the Republican Party is just doing better today with old white people. And just for a variety of reasons, maybe because they just like it out there, maybe because all the young people have left the countryside to move to the big city, rural areas are increasingly voting Republican because they are composed of individuals that are more likely to vote for the Republican Party. Or you may have heard, and you may recall a very famous book written in the mid-2000s about a rural state, Kansas. Rural residents are particularly hyped up on the most divisive issues in American politics, such as abortion, gay rights, and gun control. And they are easily duped by ambitious politicians that are willing to play the race card and carry out the cultural wars. And that's why you see such deep pockets of red out in the countryside. Or maybe you read J.D. Vance or heard him talk in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election in 2016. And he told you not about his upbringing, but about his kind of upbringing, the people he knew in Appalachia. These people, they live in communities that are down and out, destroyed by economic dislocation and the shuttering of minds. And that goes hand in hand with other accounts that say, well, hell, there ain't nothing to do out there but sit in your basement, check out the fringe websites online, listen to Donald Trump or read Donald Trump's Twitter account. There's no more community in rural areas. Of course, if there's no community, there's no jobs, they're all on meth, what are they to do but vote for a conservative or a disruptive candidate? And as a result, there is no one individual or explanation that is fit more that fits more neatly into the common explanations of why the rural-urban divide exists than Donald Trump himself. Rural America loves Trump, they say. And rural America is Trump's country. Dan and I live in rural Maine. We are from rural parts, but we are also social scientists. And we've had a tough time over the last couple of years trying to make sense of both our lived experience, but also what the data seem to suggest about these common explanations. And so a few years ago, Dan and I set out to figure out which one of those was maybe the most true, if any of them had a kernel of truth in it. And we began what's known as the Rural Voter Project. On the one hand, we were very interested in that historical development. The fact that if you go back to 1976 and you compare that map with what you see in 2020, rural areas look different. Yes, a lot of that change is confined to the South, but rural areas outside of what political scientists usually call the traditional Southern realignment have also changed. And so we set out to build one of the most largest data sets on historical election returns that we've ever dealt with and that largely exist in the discipline, accounting for presidential returns at the county level from 1824 to 2022, Senate returns since the adoption of the 17th Amendment in the early 20th century, and House and state legislatures as well, trying to understand how the dynamics of the rural and urban divide have fluctuated over time. Believe it or not, the most challenging part of that project was actually trying to understand what the rural and urban divide looks like across this near 200-year history, beginning at a point when most of the country is a rural country. And so we introduce a new measure to account for the level and the changing nature of rural throughout this time series. History only gets us so far. What we wanted to do after we deciphered these historical trends is to actually give rural voters a chance to speak. Now, no doubt, you open the paper today and you saw a story on some poll. And political scientists conduct surveys and highly reputable surveys every year. But even in our most prestigious surveys, where we ask a representative sample of Americans, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 of them, and even among the highly reputed sampling firm or polling firm Gallup, where they get a daily or almost a weekly tracker of 1,000 Americans. Because rural Americans are such a small proportion of the electorate, our ability to accurately and with statistical validity describe what they think is very limited. So we've conducted, to our understanding, the largest survey of rural voters. I think that's out there. Over 10,000 of them. From Gamble, Alaska, believe it or not, we got the farthest, one of the farthest western towns, all the way up to Caribou, Maine. We asked over 250 questions specifically designed to tease out these common explanations. And that's our book. Our book is essentially a breakdown both of the history, thinking about how these two Americas either existed or didn't exist in the past, why candidates from the Republican and Democratic Party began to change their campaign strategies towards rural voters and how it played out, not just at the presidential level, but the subnational level as well. And then we address the common stereotypes of rural voters as deeply as we can. Excuse me. Our argument is this. Rural voters are different. They care about their communities. They like being from a rural place. They think rural America has value. Their towns are special. And they don't think most Americans even not only don't know that about them, not only don't want to talk about that, but instead would rather talk about things like economic restructuring and ideological extremism. But they feel like they're looked down on for thinking that. They want to stay rural. Now, this in and of itself might not be all that extraordinary. Geography matters. Yeah, rural voters are different. They live in different places. They vote differently. But when we tease it out a little bit more, what we find is that that identity, that sense that rural is different, really does make a difference in how your average rural resident interprets our political world. We ultimately make an argument that just like many marginalized groups in American politics, rural Americans, rich, poor, educated in college, hold just a college degree, and yes, white and non-white, increasingly vote as a homogeneous bloc because regardless of the individual demographic characteristics that normally predict how Americans vote, income, race, job, educational attainment, they think about the group. They make sense of politics as a rural person. And as a rural person, they are particularly attuned to messages and policies that tap into a rural sense of place. They think about the economy, for instance, through their economic, social, community point of view. And while there's probably always been an element of place-based thinking among rural voters, what we have found through historical analysis is that it's transferred from one that was highly particularized and local. Right? What it meant to be a rural voter was what it meant to be a rural Mainer or a rural South Carolinian or a rural Montanan, to one that has now become increasingly nationalized. Rural people, regardless of where you live in this country, are all in the same boat. First and foremost, the historical evidence that we amassed through that data collection project at the county level shows that this is not a story about Donald Trump. As well as Donald Trump did in 2016, I'm hoping you can see my cursor right there, the hemorrhaging of votes from the Democratic Party has been long-standing. What we're looking at here is the percent difference from the average Democratic vote in the country. Right? So we not only look at where Democrats are where Democratic votes were and were not, but really given the popularity of the candidate, where Democrats overperformed and underperformed. And if they underperform the national average, they sit below the horizontal line at 0. If they were at the national average, it is 0. We go into much greater detail in the book on this. But what we find is that, one, unlike a lot of popular accounts, rural voters, the rural-urban divide has not always been a part of our politics. 2, the rural-urban divide is historically unprecedented in today's politics, and we do not use that term lightly. And 3, Donald Trump did a little bit better with rural voters than Mitt Romney did with rural voters, that John McCain did over rural voters. And if you were to look at the trend line, Donald Trump did about what he should with rural voters. We double down on this point by showing that when Donald Trump isn't even on the ticket, that rural and urban divide exists. If you were to look at the percent of rural residents in your congressional district, beginning really in 2010, the less rural you become, the more likely you are to vote for a Republican in Congress. The more urban you are, the more likely you are to vote for the Democrat. And in state legislatures, we see the same pattern, that among mostly rural counties for the Senate, excuse me, not the state legislatures, the Senate, you see support hemorrhaging for the Democratic Party. Now, we couple that historical analysis with a detailed survey of what's on rural Americans' minds today. And we try to flesh out this notion of place-based thinking as it relates to rural economies. Why is it that rural Americans as a whole care more about how the geographic group, the rural community, is doing? We try to connect it up to public policy debates. And we confirm what a lot of polling outfits have already confirmed. Rural voters are actually not all that more extreme when it comes to abortion. And we find additional evidence that they're not all that more extreme when it comes to things like Christian nationalism. There are big differences, as my colleague Dan Shea is going to tell you, and how rural people feel pop culture portrays them, which reinforces this sense of communal distinction. But we push back on a number of different arguments, which I'm happy to get to in the Q&A, that despite the, salacious headlines, rural communities actually aren't doing all that badly when it comes to community engagement. Social capital is on the decline in both urban, suburban, and rural America. They're not comparatively more predisposed to vote for that extremist candidate. And of course, we confront the real question about how racial attitudes play out in rural America. We find very definitively that racism, it's there in rural America, absolutely, as it is there in every other community that is trying to grapple with that perplexing question. At this point, you might be wondering why we got to that answer. Because that's not what the media largely say. And we confront that, and we try to give an argument for it. For that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to walk you through it.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Earlier, Nick was saying that rural voters feel that they're not understood. They feel resentful. They feel angry. They feel like they're not portrayed in the media in an accurate way. So this is a topic, to be honest, that's not studied as much as others in political science, but we thought it would be really important to take a look. And we looked at media in a number of different ways. For example, we looked at how rural residents use social media, how they access media, what they pay attention to. That's an important part of the book. But here I thought what we thought we might do was give you an overview of the portrayal of rural life and rural Americans in both entertainment media and in the news media. So let's start with the entertainment media. So we run through our discussion of the media rather quickly. It's a bit of a survey of entertainment, books, plays, television, and movies since the turn of the century. It's fair to say most would agree that the pastoral tradition, which coincided with the Industrial Revolution, was the predominant model of literature and plays during this period. Pollyanna, Our Town, of course, O Pioneers. Villages, towns were portrayed as peaceful, a sanctuary, we might say, from the turbulence of the Industrial Revolution, the turbulence of the city, right? It was a beautiful place, charming old ladies, sweet, sentimental love stories in rural America. We see that also in films during the Depression, films and movies. Rural America becomes an escape, right? Nothing better, I think, that portrays that than the Andy Hardy series, right? A utopian small town, neighborly, fair, decent, bustling with generalized goodwill. As was said, about the only part of the Depression that we don't see in Depression era films is actually the Depression. Right after the war, the same sort of thing, right? We're in Bedford Falls, right? We're with Capra, and both the human comedy and Bedford Falls. What a wonderful place to be. Oklahoma, Music Man. Right after the war, we get the same sort of idea that these are sanctuaries, they are a calming force, they're a place where the roots of America, where real America is to be found. Things began to turn a little bit by the 1960s in television. This is the period when more Americans live in suburban and rural area than in rural areas. So we get a different take on television, right? We get the noble rube, Andy Griffith's show, some of you might remember. The Beverly Hillbillies, I think, is a fascinating example, right? So somehow they're stuck in Appalachia with Civil War era muskets, hunting for food. Jeb misses the rabbit. Up from the ground comes bubbling crude. So the first thing they do, of course, is leave their place, leave their town to go to where they should be if they've got money, to Beverly Hills. They never quite fit in. They never quite figure out shoes. They never figure out how they're to act. There's hee-haw in Green Acres and so forth and so on. Rural becomes a gag. There is, again, a bit of a nostalgia for rural life, we would say, coinciding with the turbulence of the 60s and 70s. 1972, great year for rural nostalgia. You get the Waltons, you get John Boy, you get Little House on the Prairie, The Wilderness Family, and Take Me Home, Country Roads comes out at the same time. Sort of a warm, and John Denver's song, by the way, as you probably all know, busts to the top, not just in country music stations, but in pop music stations. It is right at the top. It is a feel-good sort of rural ballad. Then we get a bit of an ugly turn. We talk about in the book Deliverance, which was in early 1970s, which was nominated for an Academy Award, the fourth largest grossing film of that year. It is a truly incredibly difficult, ugly portrayal of rural life, Appalachian rural life, right? These are businessmen from Atlanta who want to go on a rafting trip before a river is dammed up, and they confront rural poverty, incest, and they are tracked down, as some of you remember, by these rural outlaws. They are savage, and they are, in the end, really an ugly depiction of what. And it's interesting. It's not that these rural residents want their money or their gear. They just seem hell-bent on harassing these urban Americans. That introduces us to what we call the backwater outlaw or the rural monster genre. And this is fascinating. From that point on, really from the mid-70s to this day, nearly all horror films take place in rural settings. from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Friday the 13th, the Blair Witch Project, Pet Cemetery, evil, ugly, nasty places to be in America are really out in the countryside, really out in the countryside. So the rural monster is a very important part of pop entertainment in the 1980s and 90s. About a decade ago, 2 decades ago, we get another take on rural America, and it's the rural reality show. Within short order, up to 120 rural reality shows are on the air. From Life Below Zero, Fall for the Farmer, Duck Dynasty, of course, and that's Shelby in the top left. That's Shelby, Swamp Man's Shelby, I guess, who drives to town in his tractor and his bare feet, randomly shooting his gun into the air. These are quote unquote reality depictions of rural residents. Pretty tough depictions, particularly those in southern rural areas. Finally, more recently, what we see are a series of films and programs that depict rural Americans as perhaps quirky, maybe lovable, surely not sophisticated, surely different. Schitt's Creek is probably a real good example, right? So the family gets stuck in the small town of Schitt's Creek, and the entire show is their efforts to get out. Eventually they do. They perhaps learn to love the quirky ways of the locals, the unsophisticated locals. Ozark has been written about a lot, about its portrayal of Appalachian, Missouri, the Ozarks. Really a tough film if you live in that part of the world. So what does this all say? It says that by the 1980s, rural residents for the rest of America are scary and backward, crude. They're violent, promiscuous, wild. Right? I like this little shot here. This comes from an ad campaign from monster.com. Some of you might remember a job site, an employment site. They ran a series of ads telling everyone that if you want a good job, you should probably not act like these kids. There are a bunch of kids that are saying things in the camera like, when I grow up, I want to file all day. When I grow up, I want a meaningless job. When I want to grow up, I want to while away the hours not doing anything I'm satisfied with, and so forth and so on. And nearly every one of those kids who are not doing it right are depicted in rural communities, often with the flannel shirts and what we call the hat. Well, we probably don't have time to talk too much about this, but we talk about in the book a segment of the Amanda Show, which was on Nickelodeon, a kids show for years in the 1990s, called The Hillbilly Moment. And we invite our readers in the book to pull up on YouTube some of these clips, right? And Tiffany Verbeck writes about it. She says the two actors emerge from a shabby cabin wearing overalls, a straw hat, and sloppy hair. They giggle, mouths wide, missing teeth on full display, and talk like a parody of my dad. So what impact does this have? How do rural residents perceive this portrayal? Well, we asked them about that, and they were pretty darn clear that they felt resentful that the Hollywood entertainment media doesn't get it right, right? We asked, how often do you think you're portrayed accurately, right? And rural residents were almost twice as likely to say that they're never portrayed accurately, and much significantly more likely to say that only sometimes portrayed well. Rural residents, they say, are portrayed as dumb rednecks and simple-minded. We switch gears in the book and we start talking about news media depictions. So entertainment is one thing. How are they portrayed in the news media? And to get at this issue, Nick and I spent a lot of time thinking through this topic. And what we did is we overlaid the amount of time that rural residents spent engaged with media, connecting to the outer world with the portrayal through the news media. And we discovered something fascinating, what we call the rural rabble-rousers. And it comes, actually, it's okay, Nick, you can go to that slide. So it kind of goes like this. So there was an NPR story in the fall of 2002. A very well-meaning reporter wanted to get at what rural folks were thinking, right? Ron Johnson was up for re-election. What are they thinking? What's on their minds? And she could not find anyone to talk to her. As she walked through this rural community, nobody seemed to want to speak up. So what does she do? She goes to a door of a house that has a lawn littered with conservative Republican yard signs. And she knocks on the door and she's pulled in and she has this long conversation and her story emerges. What we argue is too often the media focus their attention, cover the rural rabble-rousers. And this is a group of Americans who are very different. We used two questions in our survey to distinguish what we call the deeply engaged, highly engaged from others. We asked, did you post something online today in the last 24 hours? And they were the highest ranked on our question regarding attention to public affairs. When we do that, we get about 9%, 8 or 9% of rural Americans are deeply engaged, right? They are much more conservative. They are different in some demographic ways. They're more religious, but they are angry. They believe that cities have too much say. They strongly believe that rural gets less than they deserve. And they are ready to roll up their sleeves and join the political fray. We asked, for example, is it okay for politicians to hurl insults at one another? Overall, the not deeply engaged, only about 13%. That more than tripled, quadrupled to 55% of deeply engaged said, yeah, it's okay to hurl insults. They're more likely to say women are easily offended. They're much more likely to express racist attitudes, believe that Latinos join gangs. They believe that Americans should always love their country, and they're more than twice as likely to say that they should ignore political correctness. And they are politically active as well, nearly twice as likely to get together with friends and neighbors, to wear political hats, to fly flags. When you drive into the countryside, often down the interstate, and you see that big billboard, you see that huge yard sign, we would argue that's a rural rabble-rouser. That's the deeply engaged. On top of all that, it is this group, we say, in rural America, this 9 or 10% that are linked very closely to conspiracy theories about Democrats running sex rings, about January 6th being peaceful, replacement theory, and whether or not, interestingly, whether or not the US should split up. It is this group that is very intense out in the countryside. And this is the group, we argue, that the media pays attention to. This is the group that gathers most hits, gets the stories, that gets the pictures, right? So there is a picture that started this, this section called the Trump House. It's in Pennsylvania. And it seems like a whole set of reporters going out to rural America to do their story about Pennsylvania and rural voters. They started the Trump House, someone that has decided to paint their house red, white, and blue and have statues of Donald Trump all over the place. That's where they'll start their story. That's how they're depicting the rural voter. We suggest that is a function of really three things. The first, that dramatic sells, right? The Trump House picture is better than just a normal voter on a porch. We believe there's an important distinction of the demographics of reporters. Often reporters are not from rural America. They have not gone to school in rural America. And importantly, we spend a lot of time talking about the decline of local news. There aren't many rural reporters out there. Often the Bureau, right, of the large city will send a reporter into the hinterland to talk to the rural voter. And, they're overworked, time's tough, time's short. So they'll talk to the rural rabble-rouser because they're the ones that were standing up at the town hall meeting, yelling and screaming. Why not get the story from them? So Nick, maybe I'll pass it back to you.
Sure. So there is, of course, a rural-urban divide. We've been given a lot of reasons for why it exists. And when I go back to that initial list, I mean, Dan and I don't deny that there's some composition effects, right? It does matter that rural America is demographically older and whiter. But to the extent that we emphasize in our national political discourse, or to the extent that political campaigns think that the rural and urban divide is solely a function of composition, well, you're going to overlook the fact that there are a lot of non-whites in rural areas. You're going to overlook the fact that rural America is the most diversifying part of the country at the moment. You are going to overlook the fact that many folks, regardless of race and age in rural places, are thinking about politics in the same way. If you are going to lean into the explanation that it's strictly economics or social collapse, you're going to overlook the fact that there's quite a number of places in rural America that are doing just fine. In fact, Dan and I opened the book kind of talking about our drive into Waterville. Waterville is a post-industrial town. The last mill closed, I think, in the early 2000s. By all accounts, in our rural communities, schools are better, the crime is lower, there's deep pockets of poverty, but so too are there in urban areas. That itself is not going to explain it. And as we stress in the book, policies alone are not going to ameliorate this gap. Policy is important, but so is validation. And that is why we routinely stress the idea that perceptions are what count. Perceptions is politics. And that's why politics is so fascinating, sometimes tough to understand. Rural America has a problem with the Democratic Party. Rural Americans do not trust the Democratic Party. Rural Americans do not trust figures associated with the Democratic Party. Rural Americans do not trust Democratic governors. This is the mean feeling thermometer among Democrats. This is the mean feeling thermometer among Republicans in urban, suburban, and rural areas. Rural Republicans, rural Trump voters are different in how they treat the Democratic Party than suburban Republicans. Even urban or rural Democrats are less warm, feel less or feel more hostility towards the Democratic Party, at least at the national level. Now, don't mistake us. Dan and I are not telling you a sympathetic story. Our goal is not to convince you that this is a group of people that you should admire, that this is a group of people that get American politics right. No, there's a lot of distressing things in our book, especially when it comes to rural residents' resistance towards policies that specifically address racial inequalities. What Dan and I try to do in this book is sort out all these individual explanations and figure out which one sticks. Now, forgive us, we are social scientists, and so we go to great lengths throughout the book to truly write so that everybody can understand this. Because at the end of the day, we're very interested in how neighbors understand their neighbors. We do package this all together in a model, the workhorse of modern social science, and try to figure out which of these explanations really does explain rural voters. This is what we call the rural voter model. It's a coefficient plot of a multi-level regression model to understand which sets of questions predict whether or not you like the Democratic Party among rural voters and not rural voters. And it turns out a lot of those common explanations are not specific to rural people. You know, the more you are likely to profess belief in evangelicalism, the less likely you are to like the Democratic Party, or the more likely you are to dislike it. The more likely you buy into what we as scholars call the battery of questions related to racial resentment, the more racially resentful you are, the more likely you are to dislike the Democratic Party. But on three big things: civic pride, love of your community, feeling like you've been let down, and feeling like the government does not care about your area, only rural voters are swayed against the Democratic Party on those criteria. You know, I think we sort of try to capture a lot of pieces, a lot of history, and a lot of moving parts in a short period of time. What we would like to do now is turn it over to questions that you all have, and hopefully we can answer.
Great, thank you both so much. My name is Miyako Yerrick, and I'm the admin for the ColumbiaDC alumni group here. So we have a couple of questions that have already come in, but if you in the audience were listening, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A function and we can get to them that way for the rest of the evening. Okay, so you showed us a few graphs and quite a bit of information. I'm wondering if each of you can let us know something that surprised you the most. What was kind of not what you were expecting out of the data that you found?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I think as we were heading into this, I expected that rural voters would be far right on most policy questions. I thought they would be distinct, not only from the rest of America, but distinct from non-rural Republicans. And that's not what we found. Abortion's a good example, but there are many other policy questions when they're on the right of probably the American mean, but they're not on the right from non-rural Republicans. There really are sort of mainstream Republican positions out in the hinterland. That's one. I'm gonna give you another one real quick. I know I'm only supposed to say one. That rural communities there are doing, there's a lot of civic pride. They're not withering away. They're not dying on the vine. One of the great questions, sorry, Nick, maybe I'm stealing this from you. There's one of the great question was, if you had a chance to move away, would you do so? And about rural Americans were twice as likely to say they would not move from where they are than suburban and urban residents. I thought that was fascinating. It's pretty tough out there, but it's tough across America. That was two. I was supposed to do one, but sorry.
Well, I'm going to take two as well. And the first thing that came to my mind, truthfully, is, you know, I've read a lot of books about American political history, American political development. You know, like to think that I know something about it. And in actually doing the work to find rural people historically, right? Making sense of the fact that in 1789, when 95% of the country is rural, and how do you account for that changing, or what we call the shifting baseline around time? I was sure that we would find some historical precedent. You know, I do not use that term unprecedented lightly. And damn, I was really floored that even in the great populist uprising of the late 1800s, the agrarian protests, the farmers' revolts, the marches on DC, that it never coalesces anywhere close to a rural constituency like you see today. And that's a little unnerving to the extent that our geography is so dependent, or excuse me, our political institutions are so dependent on geography. You know, I don't like raising the democracies are going to die flag, but it does raise serious questions about the resiliency of American institutions if this divide persists. And again, Dan and I see a question, why did we ask so much about the Democratic Party? Dan and I, we had a lot of fun writing this book because we disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, let alone, whether the Democratic Party is good for rural America. But what we don't disagree on is the fact that if the Democratic Party doesn't even show up in rural America, the same with Republicans not showing up in urban America. The one thing we know is that when one party monopolizes a region and there is no competitive electoral pressures, that's where democracy crumbles. And I was floored that really we have not been through that divide before. I had a second one, but I'll restrain myself.
Well, I'm wondering, I just read somewhere that there are a number of Republican candidates at the very local level who run unopposed, and that can go all the way up to kind of city council, maybe even up to, I think, congressmen. So is that something that you only see in kind of the rural Republican Party, or is that something that does exist in kind of more urban Democratic areas?
Go ahead, Nick.
No, it is a phenomenon in urban areas. The data we've collected is that the state legislative races, it is accentuated in rural parts. That is, you are likely to find an increasingly number of uncontested races in very dense urban areas as you are in rural areas, but you are more likely than in the urban areas to find uncontested races in rural parts.
And maybe I'll just add to that, it's not just uncontested races, it's also that it's really tough to express any support for Democrats in many rural communities, right? Don't do yard signs. You don't talk about it down at the bar, down at the diner. It's tough in these one-party areas. It's not just uncontested races. It is airing a different take on a policy question, different take on a candidate.
Okay, well, I think I have spent a good 5 minutes here, and we have a ton of questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get right into them. And so there was a few people who were asking about kind of why your questions were oriented around dislike towards the Democratic Party, or kind of attitudes towards the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, and how do they kind of distinguish themselves?
Well, I think that's what we're seeing, right? So here's what I would say. I'm talking to my students earlier today about that. Isn't that rural communities are conservative? When I was young, they were more likely to be conservative. I grew up in upstate New York. Otsego County was always conservative. The city of Oneonta was Democratic. So you expect the rural area, it would be 60 or 62 or 65%. Now rural communities are getting 75 and 80% of the vote. Something dramatic has changed. And it is an anger, it is a resentment, it is a hostility directed at Democrats, directed at Democratic candidates. So that's why we ask those questions.
I mean, we do ask, what I showed you were the feeling thermometers towards the Democratic Party, Fauci, President Biden, Democratic governor. We do ask the reverse of those. The patterns fit, though, what you might expect. The partisans come home. Democrats are lukewarm, to the Republicans. And we only had one Democratic president at the time, but Democrats are lukewarm to Republican governors, to the NRA, to evangelical mega pastors, for instance. Believe it or not, the most hostile group in America towards evangelical mega church pastors are rural voters. So we do. It just, there is a corollary story. There is another book that needs to be written on the urban voter. And sort of, if you don't mind, seeing the question, how does this relate to the idea that there are people that think about politics as somewheres, localist versus anywheres, kind of cosmopolitans. This is a very compelling narrative. It explains a lot about populist insurgencies worldwide and throughout industrialized democracies, that there is a cosmopolitan elite and there's people that are locally oriented. Dan and I, in our survey of urban voters too, we ask a lot of place-specific questions, and we find that there's a lot of urbanites that think about politics through spatially oriented worldviews. They care that their city is, struggling, and they care how their city does. They think that social mobility is on the decline in their large urban city, like they are somewheres. But urbanites do not share that at a national level. And urbanites do not feel the same sense of cultural precarity. Urbanites do not feel the same level of resentment towards government and how government treats people living in urban areas. And that's the difference. I'm going to stop reading the questions so you can.
If there are ones that I don't get to, please do bring them up.
Please, I like that one, because I couldn't remember the name of the book.
Well, we have very well-read alumni usually at these events, so they'll also throw out some stuff for you as well.
And ask me to follow up on that one if I wasn't clear.
Yeah. We have a question from Margaret, who says, hasn't this divide existed from the founding of our country, leading to decisions about allocation of congressional representatives, among other things? Southern agrarian is for one example.
Yeah, well, we talk about that, right? Sure, that battle between Jefferson and Hamilton was really a geographic battle. The Whiskey Rebellion, right? The only time that a president donned a uniform to head out as commander-in-chief was essentially about a geographic issue, right? The whiskey tax. So we do talk about that, and what we see is that it's not really nationalized, this sense of rural as a particular nationalized community doesn't emerge until the 1980s. So it is region specific, is the way I would describe it. Region specific throughout most of American history. That we talk a lot about the populists in the Midwest around the turn of the century, and the Yankee farmers from New England, and the plight of rural Americans, both black and white, in the South. It's region specific, and it ebbs and flows in terms of partisanship really until the beginning of the 80s.
Sometimes we refer to the southernification, sorry, not my word, the southernification of rural politics, which is understandable. I'm from Virginia, and it's easy to think about rural politics as that thing that happens in the South. It would be perhaps more historically accurate to not call it a rural and urban divide than a sectional divide. And just another little factoid that we sort of stumbled upon. I'm not sure if this is widely known or if anybody else had that fact, but even on the eve of the Civil War, 70% of your Union residents live in rural communities. I mean, the North is much more urbanized than the South in 1860. And there's a nascent urbanization in the early 1800s, as Dan alluded to, Hamilton sort of envisioning a manufacturing and global commerce hub in New York and Massachusetts. But this is a majority rural country into the 1920s.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here I'm going to put together. So there was one on how much would you contribute the movement of manufacturing to overseas and reduced upward mobility as the generator of rural frustration, ready to be exploited by Dept political candidates? And that immediately kind of made me think at least of unions and how Democrats used to be heavily involved with unions. and somebody says, did you look into the role of unions in rural America, and has union participation evolved in rural America? Of course, we just saw the Ford, GM, Stellantis union UAW deal. So kind of how overseas manufacturing and then the role of unions in America.
Yeah, it absolutely is a critical part of the story. But there's some irony to it that the great defenders of free trade and free markets are the ones that are getting rural votes, as those communities have borne the brunt of globalization and open trade market economies. Of course, every rural, well, I won't say every, of course, it is a Democratic president from the South and a rural area person who signs NAFTA into law. And it is his wife that loses big time in rural areas, especially in the Midwest, that suffered greatly in the 20 years after the signing of NAFTA. There's no denying that the move to a more global economy, the exporting of manufacturing jobs out of rural America has been a part of this shift. And as many of you likely know, I mean, given the fact that, just given basic political economy, after World War II, in fact, as a large result of World War II and military mobilization, manufacturing is much more likely to be found in rural communities than it is urban communities. Nobody wants to put a factory in the middle of Detroit anymore when you can buy very cheap land next to an interstate in Tennessee that also has very anti-union policies. But here's the thing. Although rural communities have definitely borne the brunt of that as a percentage of jobs lost, lots of urban blue-collar workers lost their jobs too and aren't voting the same way. Lots of wealthy rural people are just doing fine, and they're voting like the working class Joe. In fact, inequality in rural America is just as high as it is in urban America in terms of the distribution of wealth. And believe it or not, social mobility, your chances of improving on the social rungs, is better in rural America than it is urban America. So I think economics is important, but there's a reason why we wanted to emphasize some of the cultural story tonight, because economics is not determinative of this pattern.
Let me just add 30 seconds to that. One of the key differences that we talk about in these NAFTA ghost towns, the rural NAFTA ghost town, is very often the manufacturing was the lifeblood of the town. Unlike in urban areas where there are many cities or many opportunities, as that small manufacturing plant, that mill, that mine closes down, the town dies. And that builds to this shared fate that we've been talking about the threats to their lives, to their communities.
We just had a question come in on, you've mentioned that rural communities, some of them are not falling apart economically despite some of this job outsourcing and factory closings, but can you give us an example of like one of those towns and what has stepped in to make up the difference so that they aren't kind of economically collapsing?
Yeah, so we open up with the story of the once rural community and still has a pretty good critical mass of rural voters down in Calabash, North Carolina, Last Beach in North Carolina. This is a place, I mean, it's hard to get more rural and tell a deeper rural story because the farmers will proudly show you their land grants from King Charles. I mean, these are farms, these are families that have been there before this country was even started. It is no longer a rural community, but there are rural voters that are still there. It's incredibly bifurcated by Route 17. I'm sure there's somebody in the audience that has made this trip down to the lovely Carolina shores. What has replaced it in a lot of these places? Tourism and cheap real estate. And it is as lovely as it is to visit those places. It's hard working in those industries. It's hard trying to make your life working in an industry in which your entire anticipated income can go out the window because of a few rainy weekends, or up here in Maine, it didn't snow enough, or like our leaf peepers that are bed and breakfast out in Vermont, the leaves did not last on the trees for 3 weeks and just in 2. It's a volatile industry as much as it is a lovely place to visit. And then real estate, your community's gone. That's my story out in Virginia, in all honesty. Maybe you live there.
Well, I grew up in Northern Virginia, but my mom lives out in Churchville, Virginia, and I definitely see the differences when I go out and visit. Okay, we have a question here that you touched on the fact that rural communities are not exclusively white communities. Were there any surprises from minority rural voters that dispelled stereotypes that minority Republicans vote against their interests?
You have to reread that one to me again, or I'll pull it up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Were there any surprises from minority rural voters that dispelled stereotypes that minority Republicans vote against their interests?
Oh. Well, I'm always reticent. I do not answer the vote against your interest question, because I think a lot of the motivation for this book is trying to understand that people come to their interest in a lot of different ways. And what distinguishes a lot of rural people is that they come to define their interest based off of the geographic places that they call home. You know, and just to elaborate on that point before I turn to the point about non-white rural residents, you know, just think about how you make your decision at the ballot box. I think about what it means for me professionally. I think what it means for me ideologically. I think about what it means for my pocketbook, how I did that year. I'm not a rural voter like we find nationwide. I'm not always thinking about how my community's doing and which candidate is an authentic representation of my community. Now, there's a lot more work to be done on this question. There's a lot more work to be done on this question because when about 20% of 20% you're trying to make conclusions about, you want to be very careful about statistical certitude. Now, we get several thousand non-white rural residents. This is a group that conventional polls can never speak to. We get hundreds of indigenous persons. We get hundreds of people of color, especially throughout the South. We get many non-English speaking Latinos in the West. And what is surprising is that they do think in these spatially oriented terms in much the same way that your typical white voter does. Their grievance towards government is at similar levels, but urban non-whites also have a lot of grievances towards the way in which government affects their specific places. But so there's this placial distinction.
And maybe for Dan, to what extent is gerrymandering the root of the divide?
You know, we confront that early on, and to be honest, not that much, right? We explore counties, right? And county boundaries don't change. Now, it's fair to say that gerrymandering can make a difference at the margins, but you know, important books have been written, important articles have been written that suggest that one of the problems with geographic sorting is that Democrats are more likely to gather in urban areas, right? So some of the problems of gerrymandering for the Democrats is that Democrats are more likely to concentrate in higher levels in urban areas, right? So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that people are naturally moving with and connecting with ideologically homogenous residents. And regardless of where the district boundaries fall, of county or community, if it's conservative, it's conservative. So we confront that, we take a look at it, and we don't think it's a particularly important part of the story.
Okay, we have a few questions on kind of the difference between rural voters feeling like the government has failed them, and you would think that NAFTA ghost towns would be looking for more government help, not less, and kind of the idea that a lot of the, I think it's the Infrastructure Reduction Act or the infrastructure law, a lot of that money is actually going into Republican districts, but the people are still voting Republican and saying like, no. So can you kind of talk about that divide a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
No, sure. So hot off the press. I mean, I got you one better, and maybe 2 days. So we actually cracked the number, checked the numbers today. We geotagged every single project that's been announced for the Inflation Reduction Act. If you need a scoop, here it is. So yeah, it's been widely reported that it's going increasingly to Republican districts, including many Republicans that voted against it. About 30% of the estimated jobs and about 29% of the estimated investments going to rural counties. So when they make up about 20% of the population, they're about 10% overrepresented than what they should. Will it make a difference? I doubt it. I mean, I'm pleasantly surprised that Joe Biden was in Minnesota, I believe today, rural Minnesota, talking about it. I have not looked at the remarks. I would be surprised if the White House knew that a third of their investment was going to rural areas. He was there talking about sustainable agriculture and infrastructure and broadband internet. Of course, everyone knows that increasing broadband internet is going to save rural communities. I think there's good reason for rural voters to say like, hey, that's good for us. We should support that policy. We should support that party that actually is sending money and investments to us. I find it fascinating that they don't. And when you talk to our neighbors, when you talk to some of the rural residents that informs much of our thinking on this book, and you say, hey, man, Joe Biden, broadband internet. Get a strange class. Broadband internet, I don't need that. It's not going to pay my mortgage. It's not going to stop the fact that because out-of-staters are moving into my state, this is very Maine specific, because out-of-staters are moving into state, my property taxes, because my assessed real estate value has gone up 40% in the last 3 years. That ain't helping me today. It's tough to convince people about these long-term investments. I think the Democrats have been historically very reticent to message on that line. I don't think they know how to talk about rural policy because they don't know how to talk about rural politics. Can I share a story, Dan, or do you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll real quickly, and then you can keep going, Nick. We've been talking a lot about bottom-up pressures. We've been talking about what's happening on the ground for rural Americans, but savvy Republican operatives, and we argue Ronald Reagan was really quite good at this, and Pat Buchanan and Sarah Palin and on, have been able to really tap into this idea that you should be skeptical, that the federal government is there to help you, right? This is a long-standing, simmering skepticism, right? You were told that all boats were going to lift with NAFTA. That didn't happen. WTO, that didn't happen, and so forth. But then coming in the other direction, top down, you've got savvy Republicans really pushing that issue, pushing the fact that the government is not there to help you. They're actually out to get you.
So my story is close to y'all's home. Right? You all remember Terry McAuliffe running for governor. This was in his last election, right, against Youngkin. And Terry McAuliffe is on a campaign stop whistle tour down in southwestern Virginia. He stops in Wise, Virginia, deep rural part of our state, of my former state. He stops there in August. Gets on the podium. He's jawing it up, right? And people are watching. It's a little small crowd. And he leans over to this little boy. He says, "Oh, have you gotten any big ones lately?" Talking about hunting. Terry McAuliffe, he knows that you hunt. He likes that. It's August. You ain't hunting in August. Now, I know it might seem silly to say, why does that matter? If you genuinely deep down in your heart believe that somebody like McAuliffe compared to Youngkin is going to invest in schools, is going to give jobs back to these communities, is going to help rural areas make the clean energy transition. But you also know it matters. You have to trust these people. And I get why somebody might look at that and say, you don't get me. I wanted to say an expletive, but you don't understand me. What's your real motive? You really think I can be bought off? There's just no trust towards the Democratic elite. And yep, here we go. Basket of deplorables. Yep. And Hillary Clinton. I'm sorry, Dan, when you have a leading presidential candidate for the Democratic Party trying to make sense of why she lost, and she seems to relish the fact that she won the places moving ahead and he won the places moving behind. How do you think that plays out among people that are living in the places moving behind? When in fact, we probably all know that the reason those places are moving ahead is because of rampant income inequality and the ultra wealthy pulling up GDP in urban areas. But either way, besides the point, she won the places moving ahead.
Yeah.
He won the places.
That story we tell about contrasting conversations with Clinton and coal miners and Trump and coal miners says a lot about empathy and understanding. And Clinton's going to transform the community into clean energy, and don't worry, we're going to retrain you and so forth. And Trump comes in and says, I understand that this is part of who you are. In so many words, probably a little better than me, the way he said, but there was empathy there that Clinton just couldn't get.
We have a really interesting historical kind of question here from James. He says, did post-World War II social mobility, given GI Bill, standardized testing, educated elites shifting to major urban centers, so did that post-World War II social mobility create the resentments you've been talking about and strip traditional leadership from the rural areas?
Well, there was a transformation, and we're very careful throughout the book to talk about or to remind readers that rural doesn't mean agriculture. Only about 6 or 8% of rural Americans are involved in agriculture, so it's not the same. But in the post-war era, there was a dramatic transformation of farming and farming communities. This was the period of the rise of corporate farming, the demise of family farms. It begins in earnest after World War II, picks up speed actually even through the Reagan administration. There are tremendous incentives for corporate agriculture, not family farms. So that's a piece of what the question is getting at, an important transformation, the decline of agricultural communities. There's other pieces I'm sure Nick maybe wants to mention.
Okay, so we have a question. Do you believe that there's anything that can be done to rectify the misunderstanding and misrepresentation of rural America? If there are so many factors working against a fair representation, does there need to be a concerted effort somewhere to correct or counter the ideas put forth by popular media? And then I will just note there was another comment earlier on the Duck Dynasty and the Waltons, and that you said they were making fun of rural America, but for William, he said, it seems to portray these families as living by a set of values and practices in our whole country that would be better off to recommit to, saying that there is admiration in those shows. So maybe kind of speak to those two comments.
I could do the Duck Dynasty. That's actually correct, and we talk about that in the book. We end the chapter, the cultural chapter, with a few pages on Duck Dynasty. It's interesting, though, it was in large measure a manufactured reality show. Members of Duck Dynasty family that had advanced degrees, and they were business majors. They were savvy entrepreneurs that were portrayed in this family as sort of all this time on their hands and sort of scheming and creating new sort of mischief throughout the office and so forth. But there are parts of Duck Dynasty that we talk about, particularly the celebration of patriotism and gun culture, right? So I talked earlier about no real policy differences between rural Americans and Republicans elsewhere. The one exception is policy questions. With regard to, and I'll be real quick, with regard to what we might do on the portrayal of rural Americans, we talk a good bit about what reporters and journalists should do to talk to average rural Americans and not go to the most dramatic, the most flamboyant. Take the time to find a quieter rural American, the rural American that's more likely to represent the other 90%.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of why we wrote the book, to try and begin to, well, to figure out, how much of it was true. And then it did become a sort of a labor of really trying to paint as deep a portrait as possible of rural voters, so that people begin to take this perspective seriously. We've been writing about this for a number of years, including before Trump. And damn, I mean, actually, if I may, Dan, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post one time talking about a lot of the same stuff I'm talking about today. And what does the graphics editor of the Washington Post do? Pops up one of the pictures that Dan actually showed you. God knows Trump won on a billboard. That's the exact opposite of what I'm trying to tell you that they're thinking and why they're voting the way they do. They're not a bunch of evangelical nuts. And yet, here's the editor of one of our leading national papers of record saying, "Well, writing about rural voters, this is the infographic to tell the story." There's a lot of people that are dismissive of this account, and some of it is because a lot of the work in this area has been what we might call ethnographic. It's been deep case studies. Some of you might be very familiar with the work of another political scientist, Kathy Kramer, out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And, we're indebted to a much larger research agenda and group of scholars that are tirelessly trying to understand really how rural voters are coming to understand their interests. And a lot of times those perspectives get discounted by the Paul Krugman types of the world because they're not rigorous enough. They're not predicated on deep, quantitative data. Dan and I showed up, and we just want to, throw down the gauntlet. If I may, on the Democrats, I do think one of the things that Democrats, especially, think about the most activist of Democrats, the core of the Democratic Party, donors, the interest groups that are thinking about strategy in DC. The one thing that they are very reticent to change, and I think it's fine, is the party's, it can be criticized, but there's undoubtedly more of a move towards, racial egalitarianism in the Democratic Party. And they feel that it might be sacrificed if you try to, court over bigots in the countryside, right? And that there is no desire to sacrifice racial liberalism for picking up a few votes in rural America. And Dan and I want to tell you that's a false choice. There is going to be a core of rural residents that are never going to vote for a candidate that espouses racially progressive views. But there is a critical mass of rural voters that the Democratic Party has left and thrown into, if I dare I say, that basket of deplorables that will actually vote for him and will vote for a candidate that espouses principles of racial justice. And you got to buy the book, I guess, to be fully convinced of that point. But
well, we shared the discount code, and we'll do it again so that they can do that. So we have a couple of questions on journalism. Stella says that you touched on the lack of local journalism in rural communities and says, what factor do you think the ownership of the media that is available in rural communities affects these attitudes? And then we had a question on to what extent did you find differences in news sources among rural Americans, and how much did that shape their views?
Well, they're linked together. Rural Americans are less likely to pay attention to local news, right? And that's the function of decline of local news, right? There are a number of really important studies out recently on news deserts, right? The shrinking number of outlets across America. It's happening in urban, suburban, and rural areas, but particularly in rural areas. And it is exactly because of what you'd think it would be, a declining readership, declining audience. There's some ad revenue related issues. It's expensive. It's difficult to have a local news outlet. So what we get instead is nationalized programs, even in the local newspapers that exist. Most of the stories these days are wire stories. There aren't a lot of local reporters anymore that understand the community that they're supposed to cover. These folks are overworked. It's a tough, tough job. So it's a real problem. What we suggest in the end in the book, even when the outlet that's doing well in the urban area sends their reporter out to get the story, again, there's more to it than the rabble-rousers. So the answer is that there are some real difficult economic issues against local outlets in America all over, particularly in rural communities.
I mean, there's only 62 charts in the book, but you mind if I just show one more?
Oh yeah, we might have to switch the host.
Yeah.
To you. There we go.
Let's look at, so this is what Dan was describing. Rural people are actually not only less likely to tap into local news, they're not as deeply engaged in national news as you might think. They're significantly, I mean, it's very rare on these types of questions in a very nationalized electorate that place is so discriminatory, meaning place does the bulk of the explanation and the variance. Only about 12% of rural residents are subscribing to a local newspaper. You're getting closer to 30% among urban residents, and they might not even be thinking that the Washington Post is a local newspaper as well. This is what floors me. When you look at a question, do you agree that the news is irrelevant to your community? I think actually the way we asked this was, how relevant is news to your community? Almost a majority of rural Americans say it's not. That's a news desert. And that matters for both we were just talking about the facts, right? Their policies are helping these places. Well, if they're not learning about it, can you really blame them for not supporting that candidate, that person?
Just a real quick anecdote on this. In 2008, Obama did better than Kerry did in rural communities. He lost handedly in rural communities, but he did a bit better. It was a bit of a bump up. One of the explanations was that he was able to connect to a number of local rural media outlets. They were still around in 2008. And he paid particular attention to them, and he went to see the editors, particularly during the primaries, went state by state, meeting with these reporters, meeting with these editors, and telling his story. That's all gone now. There's nobody to talk to. There's no office to visit anymore.
All right, we have just a few minutes left, and I've been saving a bunch of these questions for our last question. So everybody is saying, all right, we get it. A lot of things aren't working. The Democrats aren't going into the rural areas. So what could Democratic candidates do? What kind of policies could they offer if the IRA isn't really reaching them? What could possibly change this?
Well, one thing's for sure is they don't have to abandon democratic principles. We show that in the end of the book. There's not, of those few Democrats in Congress that are from rural areas, they're not particularly conservative. You know, Jared Golden, Maine's 2nd district is on our minds now because he changed his vote on assault weapons. But overall, there's no clear relationship between ideology and geography for the Democratic Party, right? So it's not that you have to dramatically change your policy positions. We think it's all about connection and authenticity, right? It's about showing up and being an authentic rural person and understanding the concerns, the values, the perspectives of the rural voter. I'm sure Nick has more to add, but I think authenticity is a word that we use over and over in the conclusion.
That's where I'd begin and sort of end, right? So there's been a couple of books out there saying, we got to learn how to talk to one another. You got to walk up the dirt road and knock on the doors. That's not enough. You got to have somebody that speaks the language too, that's from the community, right? If we're talking about a demographic that is highly attuned to geographic inequality, very proud of their particular place, you can't fly in a Democrat that went to Harvard and says, I live in a rural community, and I know what you're like. You got to get behind and you got to support with the full finances available of your party apparatus, authentically rural candidates. You kind of got to, if I was giving advice to, DNC or funders, or, to the extent that you can give advice to primary voters, it's not going to go over well. You got to let Joe Manchin be Joe Manchin sometimes. You got to let Jared Golden be Jared Golden sometimes. Again, it's you're talking about the difference between showing up in a rural community and competing and not always winning, but you could win in a lot of these places. We estimate there's probably about 1/3 to 35% of rural voters that would flip, which would make the difference in a lot of these communities. Versus minority rule, because you've given up on races.
There was an interesting comment earlier from someone on Hillary Clinton moving from Arkansas to New York. And it kind of reminded me of, I think it was Mitt Romney was from Massachusetts and moved out and now is Utah. And even like Dr. Oz, I don't remember where he lived, but he was running in Pennsylvania. So we almost see Republicans actually moving out more to the rural areas while Democrats are moving into urban areas. And so we're losing that representation, and they're, more strategic, I think, across the board. All right, well, we have over 24 or almost 24 questions left that we didn't get to. So thank you everyone for the participation tonight. We did record this event, and so we will be sharing it tomorrow on our YouTube channel. If there are any other resources that you would like to share with the audience, we can send that out with the recording tomorrow. But otherwise, we will resend the link for you to purchase the book with the discount code. And I would like to turn it back over to both of you for any closing thoughts. And maybe we can start with Dan and finish out with Nick.
Well, we're really excited. It's out. First off, Columbia did a great job. We're very happy with Columbia Press. Columbia U Press did a really wonderful job. We're excited about it. We think it can make a difference. It's a big book. We've been saying for some time. It's a big book. We cover a lot of ground, but it's ground that needed to be covered. One of the best things that are, to me, that one of the early reviewers said, it's a long-awaited corrective. And I thought that's really a great line. So thank you. We really appreciate you tuning in to us tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity. I love talking with people about the work, about the findings, about your lived experiences. I see it in a number of questions that you're either from a rural area, you got family in rural areas, feel free to send me an email. I respond to the haters and the lovers.
I don't respond to the haters.
I love it. Haters are actually my favorite to respond to. So if you hated what you listened tonight, I will respond.
Send it
But
to me.
thank you very much, and thanks to everybody at the Columbia Alumni Association for giving us this platform to talk about our work. We do really appreciate it, and boy, it's wonderful to see all the comments and questions from such a great audience. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, both, and everyone. Have a great night.